In October of 1907, the entire American economy was collapsing. Banks were failing by the hour. Crowds pressed against locked doors, screaming for money that no longer existed. The stock market was in freefall. The United States government, the most powerful nation on earth, had no central bank, no emergency fund, no way to stop the bleeding. And so the President of the United States did something almost unthinkable. He turned to one man, not a general, not a senator, not an institution, a 70-year-old banker with a fortune, a private library, and a reputation that made grown men go quiet when he entered a room. For 3 days and 3 nights, this man locked the most powerful financiers in America inside his mansion and refused to let them leave until they saved the country. At one point, he physically kept them in a room, turned the key, and put it in his pocket. And it worked. One private citizen stopped a national collapse that the government itself could not stop. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, and by the time he died, people asked a question that historians still argue about today. Was he the man who saved America from disaster again and again? Or was he the man who became so powerful that a single banker had grown stronger than the government of the United States? To understand how one person accumulated that much control, you have to go back before the mansions and the panics and the empires he assembled with a signature. Because the story of how Morgan gained his power is stranger, colder, and far more calculated than most people ever realize. Most fortunes in the Gilded Age began with a poor boy and a dream. Morgan's did not. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, into money and expectation. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was not just wealthy. He was building one of the most important banking connections in the world, a bridge between American business and the deep capital of London. So while other future tycoons were learning to survive, young Pierpont was being engineered into a financier. His father shaped him deliberately, sending him to school in Switzerland, then to university in Germany, where he became fluent in French and German and showed a striking gift for mathematics. Professors reportedly thought he could have become a mathematician, but Junius had other plans. His son would not solve equations, he would command capital. And yet behind the privilege was a boy who suffered. For most of his life, Morgan was tormented by a disfiguring skin condition that swelled and reddened his nose grotesquely. Photographers were forbidden from capturing it clearly. Children stared, adults looked away. The most powerful financier in the world spent his entire life unable to escape his own reflection. Here was the first great contrast of his life. Immense wealth and status on the outside, deep insecurity and physical pain underneath. That tension, the need to control a world that he could not always control on his own face, would follow him into every deal he ever made. By his early 20s, Morgan was working in finance in New York, learning fast, taking risks, and revealing a side of himself that would define his career. He was not interested in playing small, and his first real taste of profit would come from something his father would have been furious to discover. During the American Civil War, while hundreds of thousands of men were dying on battlefields, a young Morgan was learning a colder truth. War is also a market. In one early episode that would follow his reputation for decades, Morgan was connected to a deal involving defective rifles. Guns were purchased cheaply from a government arsenal, then sold back to the government at a steep markup, weapons that were reportedly dangerous to the soldiers firing them. Morgan's exact role has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue he was simply financing the transaction. Others saw something darker, but the pattern it hinted at was unmistakable. Where others saw chaos, Morgan saw opportunity, structure, and profit. Then came the moment that revealed his nerve. Morgan also speculated on gold during the war. When Union forces struggled, gold prices spiked, and Morgan and a partner quietly moved a fortune in gold, profiting from the nation's fear. To many, betting on gold was betting against the Union itself. He was barely into his career, and he had already learned the lesson that would define him. In moments of national crisis, while everyone else panicked, the calm operator who understood money could gain everything. But Morgan wanted more than clever trades. He wanted order. He looked at American business in the years after the war and saw something that offended him deeply: chaos, reckless competition, companies destroying each other, cutting prices until everyone bled, markets swinging wildly out of control. To most people, that was simply capitalism. To Morgan, it was a disease, and he was about to appoint himself the cure. What he did next would give him a level of influence over American industry that no private citizen had ever held before. In the late 19th century, railroads were everything. They were the internet, the oil, and the highways of their age combined. Whoever controlled the railroads controlled the movement of goods, people, grain, coal, and cash across an entire continent, and the railroads were at war. Rival lines slashed prices to destroy each other. They built duplicate tracks running side by side, just to bankrupt competitors. Fortunes were made and vaporized. Investors, especially the powerful British investors connected to Morgan's family bank, were losing enormous sums in the chaos. Morgan stepped in with a strategy so bold that it earned its own name: Morganization. He would take a failing, chaotic railroad, seize financial control, wipe out the reckless management, restructure the debt, and impose discipline and order. He installed his own people. He placed himself and his allies on the boards. He forced warring rivals to stop fighting and cooperate. In 1885, in a legendary moment, Morgan reportedly gathered the leaders of two bitter railroad rivals aboard his yacht and refused to let them off until they reached a peace agreement. Trapped on the water, surrounded by nothing but the bankers' calm authority, they gave in. Piece by piece, line by line, Morgan pulled the fractured American rail system under coordinated control. But there was a price for this order, and it was not paid by Morgan. The men he installed answered to him. The boards he sat on gave him quiet influence over vast stretches of the economy. Competition, the thing that was supposed to protect ordinary people from being squeezed, faded wherever Morgan brought his so-called order. By the 1890s, a single banker had woven himself into the control of a huge share of America's railroads. And still, this was not the peak of his power, because a financial disaster was coming for the entire United States. And when it hit, the government would discover a terrifying truth: it could not save itself. The year was 1895. The United States Treasury was running out of gold. At the time, American money was backed by gold, and the nation's reserves were draining away at a catastrophic rate. If the gold ran out, the dollar could collapse, and the entire financial credibility of the United States would shatter. The government of the most promising nation on earth was, in plain terms, going broke. President Grover Cleveland was cornered. Congress could not act fast enough, and the panic was accelerating by the day. So the President of the United States sat across from a private banker and effectively asked for a bailout, not from a foreign nation, not from the public, but from J.P. Morgan. Morgan had a plan, and it revealed both his genius and his nerve. He organized a private syndicate to supply the Treasury with a massive amount of gold, much of it drawn from Europe, in exchange for government bonds. In the deal, Morgan and his partners provided the government with roughly 3.5 million ounces of gold to rescue the nation's reserves. There was a chilling moment in the negotiations, when officials wondered whether Morgan could truly guarantee that the gold would hold and the crisis would end. Morgan reportedly gave his personal word that it would. And here is the part that should stop you cold. His word was enough. The word of one man calmed a national financial crisis. The market steadied, the gold flowed in, the Treasury survived. Morgan and his partners also made a substantial profit from the arrangement, and critics howled that he had exploited a national emergency to enrich himself. But the deeper story was far more unsettling than profit. The United States government had just been rescued by a private banker. The country had looked into the abyss and been pulled back, not by an institution, not by its own power, but by one individual with the connections and the nerve to command gold across an ocean. Morgan had proven something to himself and to the nation. When America broke, he could be the one to fix it, and soon he would use that reputation to build the single largest corporation the world had ever seen. By the turn of the century, one industry towered above the rest: steel. Steel built the railroads, the skyscrapers, the bridges, the ships, the factories. Steel was the skeleton of the modern world, and the king of steel was a former poor immigrant who had clawed his way to the top with ferocious ambition. Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie's steel empire was a machine of terrifying efficiency, undercutting rivals, dominating markets, and generating staggering wealth. If Morgan wanted to bring order to steel the way he had brought order to railroads, there was one immovable obstacle. He would have to buy out Carnegie himself. The problem was that no one simply bought Andrew Carnegie. So Morgan moved carefully. The story goes that Carnegie scrawled a number on a slip of paper, the price for his entire empire. When it reached Morgan, he glanced at it and accepted almost instantly. The figure was around $480 million for Carnegie's holdings, an almost unimaginable sum for the time. In 1901, Morgan combined Carnegie's empire with other steel companies to create a colossus, United States Steel. It became the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world, valued at roughly $1.4 billion, at a time when the entire federal budget was a fraction of that. Let that sink in. A single company, assembled by a single banker, was worth more than most nations. When the deal was done, Carnegie reportedly told Morgan he was now the richest man in the world, and in a moment dripping with the psychology of these titans, Morgan reportedly replied only that it was a pleasure to do business with him. Two of the most powerful men in history, deciding the fate of an entire industry, in a handful of sentences. But with this staggering achievement came a growing fear across the country. If one banker could assemble the largest company on earth, if he could rescue the treasury, if he could command the railroads and now the steel that built the nation, then who exactly was in charge of America? The elected government? Or the man in the mansion on Madison Avenue? That question was about to explode into the open, and for the first time, Morgan would face an enemy he could not simply buy, trap on a yacht, or overpower with money: the President of the United States. For decades, Morgan operated with a simple assumption: business was his kingdom, and government did not interfere. Then a new president took office, and he did not share that assumption at all. Theodore Roosevelt. Young, fearless, and hungry to prove that the government, not the tycoons, held the real power in America, Roosevelt looked at the giant combinations Morgan was building and saw a threat to democracy itself. One of Morgan's creations became the target, a massive railroad holding company called Northern Securities, formed to unite competing rail giants under one umbrella, exactly the kind of consolidation Morgan loved. Roosevelt's administration moved to break it apart using antitrust law, and the collision between the two men became legendary. According to the famous account, Morgan traveled to Washington and spoke to Roosevelt almost as an equal, as one power broker to another. He reportedly suggested that if there was a problem, Roosevelt could simply send his man to meet with Morgan's man, and they could fix it between them. It was a stunning moment. A private citizen treating the President of the United States as a fellow dealmaker, as though the government were just another firm to negotiate with. Roosevelt refused. He later made clear that this was exactly the mindset he was fighting, the idea that a banker could regard the leader of the nation as a rival operator rather than his superior. The government won. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered Northern Securities broken up. For the first time, Morgan had been publicly checked. The banker who bent railroads, industries, and even the Treasury to his will had been told no by the power of the state. But do not mistake this for Morgan's downfall, because just 3 years later, the nation would once again teeter on the edge of total collapse, and once again the government would find itself helpless, and once again, every eye in America would turn to the same aging man with the swollen face and the unbreakable nerve. Only this time, the stakes would be even higher, and what Morgan did during those days would become the most famous and most troubling episode of his entire life. In October of 1907, the panic returned, and this time it was ferocious. It began with a failed scheme to corner the stock of a copper company. When that collapsed, fear spread to the banks connected to it, then to the trust companies, then to everything. One of the largest trust companies in New York, the Knickerbocker Trust, was overwhelmed by desperate customers demanding their money. It suspended operations. Confidence shattered. The panic became a stampede. People lined up for blocks, terrified, clutching bank books, trying to pull out their savings before the money vanished. Banks that were perfectly solvent were being drained, simply because everyone was afraid at the same time. The stock market began to collapse. Interest rates on Wall Street spiked to insane levels as cash disappeared. The United States still had no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no institution capable of injecting emergency money into the system. There was only one force in America, organized and trusted enough to act: J.P. Morgan. Now 70 years old, Morgan rushed back to New York and set up command inside his private library, one of the most magnificent rooms in the country, lined with priceless manuscripts and art. From that library, he ran the rescue of the American financial system, like a general running a war. He summoned the most powerful bankers in the city. He demanded they pool their money to save the institutions worth saving. He personally decided which banks and trusts would live and which would be allowed to die. He assessed the books, made the calls, and moved millions in hours. At the climax, in the most famous moment of the entire crisis, Morgan gathered the heads of the major trust companies inside his library late at night. They hesitated. They argued. They did not want to commit their money, so Morgan locked the doors. He kept them inside and made clear that no one was leaving until they signed an agreement to put up the money needed to end the panic. Trapped, exhausted, and out of options, they finally signed in the early hours of the morning. The crisis broke. Confidence slowly returned. The system held. The nation was pulled back from the edge, again, by the will of a single man in a single room. It was Morgan's greatest triumph. And, quietly, it was also the beginning of his undoing, because when the panic ended and the fear faded, a new emotion rose in its place, and it was aimed directly at Morgan: suspicion. When the dust settled, Americans asked themselves a deeply uncomfortable question. We were just saved by one banker. But what does it say about our country that we needed one banker to save us at all? The panic of 1907 exposed a terrifying weakness. The financial system of the greatest rising power on earth had been so fragile that it depended on the personal judgment, the personal wealth, and the personal will of a private individual. If Morgan had chosen differently, if he had been out of the country, if he had simply been gone, the collapse could have been total. That realization frightened the government far more than it comforted it, and it lit a fuse. If the nation could not survive without a Morgan, then perhaps the nation needed something to replace the need for a Morgan. The conversations that followed the panic fed directly into the movement that would eventually create the Federal Reserve System, a permanent institution meant to do what Morgan had done, so that no single man would ever again hold the fate of the economy in his hands. In a strange twist, Morgan's greatest act of rescue helped inspire the very system designed to make men like him unnecessary. But the backlash was not finished. Congress launched an investigation into what people were now calling the money trust, the idea that a tiny circle of financiers, with Morgan at the center, secretly controlled the flow of money and credit across the entire nation. Investigators mapped the connections, the directorships, the board seats, the tangled web of banks and companies linked back to Morgan and his allies. And what they found alarmed them: a concentration of financial power so vast that a handful of men appeared to sit at the controls of the American economy. In 1912, an aging J.P. Morgan was called before Congress to answer for it. And in that hearing came one of the most revealing exchanges of his life. He was pressed on what commercial credit was truly based upon. Was it money? Was it property? Morgan's answer cut to the core of everything he was. He said the first thing was character, that a man he did not trust could not get money from him even with all the collateral in Christendom, and that a man he believed in could get whatever he needed on nothing more than his word. It was a stunning statement. The most powerful financier in the world declaring that at the foundation of it all was not gold, not property, but trust in a person. To his admirers, it was profound wisdom. To his critics, it was the whole problem, because it meant that a tiny group of men, trusting only each other, could decide who rose and who fell in the American economy. Morgan had defended himself with dignity and conviction, but the strain of it all was immense. and the man who had carried the weight of the nation's crises on his own shoulders was nearing the end. Shortly after that grueling testimony, Morgan's health broke down. He traveled abroad seeking rest, and in 1913 in Rome, John Pierpont Morgan died. The reaction was extraordinary. On the day of his funeral, the New York Stock Exchange, the beating heart of the financial world he had dominated, closed in his honor for part of the day. Markets paused for a private citizen as though a head of state had fallen. Then came the revelation that shocked a nation. When Morgan's fortune was tallied, it was enormous by any human standard, but far smaller than people expected, for a man who had reshaped entire industries and rescued the government itself. His estate, excluding his priceless art collection, was reported in the range of tens of millions of dollars. When Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, heard the size of Morgan's fortune, he reportedly reacted with astonishment, remarking that Morgan had not even been a rich man by the standards of the age. Think about that. The man who assembled the first billion-dollar corporation, the man who controlled railroads across a continent, the man who saved the United States Treasury and stopped a national panic with his own will, and by the standards of the true industrial billionaires, he was not even considered the richest. Because Morgan's true wealth was never really about the size of his bank account. It was about control, influence, trust, the invisible web of power that let him move fortunes he did not personally own, and command industries he did not personally build. His money could be counted, his power could not. More than a century later, we are still living inside the world Morgan helped shape. The financial house he built did not vanish. Its legacy runs directly into the modern banking giant that still carries his name today, one of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet, moving trillions of dollars through the global economy. Every time a government coordinates a bailout of the banking system, every time powerful financiers gather in a room during a crisis to decide the fate of failing institutions, they are echoing something Morgan did first, alone, from his private library, with no template and no safety net. And the Federal Reserve, the institution born in part from the fear that no nation should ever again depend on one man, now performs, on a permanent and public scale, the exact role Morgan once played as a private citizen. In a sense, we replaced J.P. Morgan with an entire system. That is how much power one man had held, and this is why historians still cannot agree on who he truly was. To some, he is the great stabilizer, the man who imposed order on chaos, who rescued the nation not once but twice, who built the industrial backbone of modern America and steadied it when it shook. To others, he is a warning, proof of what happens when private financial power grows so vast that it rivals the government itself, when competition dies in the name of order, and when the fate of millions can rest on the judgment of a single unelected man in a single locked room. Was he the savior of the American economy, or the man who made private banking more powerful than the government meant to control it? Perhaps the most unsettling answer is that he was both, at the same time, and that we have never fully decided whether to be grateful or afraid. Because the truth is, the age of the all-powerful banker did not really end with Morgan's death. It simply changed shape. And if you want to understand how that hidden power grew from a handful of men in private rooms into the vast global financial machine that shapes your life today, then the next story is one you cannot afford to miss.